What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I am the design lead of Summoners Rift Team's live pod here to talk, hopefully very briefly, about patch 14.2b, a micropatch that has gone live a couple hours ago as time of this recording, and additionally talk a very little bit about how 14.2 has landed so far. Again, we know there is still a lot of work to do in terms of live design, in terms of getting damage into the right spots. You've seen some stuff probably on the PvE, trying to bring down systemic item proc damage to lower bursts somewhat, directionally pretty good. Of course, we have to make sure that each class of champion looks good. This is not going to be about stuff into 0.3. By the time we lock that patch, I'll do a preview on that one and the goals binaural changes, but it is still something that is in my mind, and I want to make sure that, that all goes well. But let's talk about what's in this patch right now, and then we'll use that to launch and talk about how 14.2 has gone so far, even though this patch has only been live for about 24 hours. So we'll go through the individual balance changes first, which is some nerfs to brand. So from basically, I woke up this morning, I checked a bunch of win rates, and saw that a lot of our patch had landed pretty well. Some champions like Karma mid don't have a lot of play rate, and so when I very first checked, she was like a 52% win rate mid laner, and then when I checked later in the day, she was 50% mid laner, and it's like, that's totally fine. Anyways, all to say that as time went on, we're like, oh my gosh, we just noticed that Brand Jungle's win rate is absolutely absurd. I ended up doing the work here on this change. I investigated his other roles, and by the time we built out the micropatch, he had gained about 5% win rate in jungle and just over 3% win rate in mid lane and support. And then, though he is actually a viable top and bot laner, no one really plays him there. So even though those numbers were relatively close, we kind of ignored them because they're just not that relevant. And so we basically looked at, okay, well, this guy obviously gained a ton of win rate. What happened here? Tracked down that it's not like, we didn't like forget to change the monster cap on his passive or anything, but obviously via rescripting his passive to tick every quarter second instead of 1.05 seconds, he's doing a lot more passive damage. Now, granted, if you're only casting one spell on a target, you are actually getting more than the tooltip damage on the spell. That's not great. I think longer term, based on how this micropatch lands, we can... I mean, the tough thing is we don't necessarily want to lower the duration, because that's blaze combo timing, but we may need to like lower the damage per blaze tick a little bit further, because what happened essentially is the designer who made the change dropped the tick rate from 1.05 to 0.25 seconds, and then divided the damage by an extra 4, and then lowered the monster cap by 1/4 as well, or down to 1/4 of what it was. And so in many cases that would be fine, except that the way brand passive works is it lasts for like either 3.5 or 4 seconds. But because the tick rate is every 1.05 seconds, you would never on an individual spellcast ever get more than 3 ticks. And indeed, it would do like 8.333% of max health every tick, which of course is 2.5%, all mathed out, and that's fine. But because the duration is still the same to give room for landing a second spell and stacking blaze and whatnot, which is all very reasonable, it means that you're often getting 14 ticks instead of 12 ticks. So it obviously means that an individual spell cadence is going to be a lot better, and especially with Brand Jungle, where the way you clear blue buff is press Q and then the entire passive ticks down, and then you press Q again and the entire passive ticks down. Well, it turns out getting like 25% more damage from the passive is a really, really big deal for his jungle clear, and lo and behold, he gained a lot more power in the jungle. So we probably have to tune that up at some point, and either again lower the damage numbers and just assume you're going to get 14 ticks, or what. We'll sort that out at some point in time. We probably shouldn't change the blaze duration, but it also means that, hey, as a team, we failed to do this correctly, and as a team, we overbuffed the passive, right? So anyway, I can see the win rate differences and see that the win rate difference is much larger in jungle than in any other role, and my assumption is that just flatly nerfing the passive will not disproportionately nerf jungle. I could be wrong about that one, but my assumption was that it wouldn't disproportionately nerf jungle. Basically, nerf his passive by about 20%. That should, in a like one spell context, be pretty similar to the buff he got from the initial change. But in addition to that, the fact that he's getting a more frequent tick rate on his passive means he's applying Liandry's. He's like refreshing Landry's better. He's refreshing Riley's better. Like in a case where you have really, really high tenacity, it was probably possible to drop the Riley slow between ticks. That would be pretty silly, of course, but just in general, pretty sure, you get higher consistency on things like Comet or Dark Harvest and whatnot, and you can, more reliably get the thing to trigger or refresh the cooldown or whatever. So it's like, there's enough here where I'm like, okay, because, so to circle back, basically, anytime you're casting more than one spell, because of the sort of buff duration refresh. So the case, right, is if you just cast Q, you're going to get about 25% more damage on the passive, which if you invert by 20%, this maths out to the same total throughput on the spell in the average case, whatever. If you cast more than one spell, or you like extend your duration because you're pressing Q, then you're waiting, you're pressing E, then waiting, pressing W, whatever, that washes out pretty quickly. And so in a case where you're casting 2 or 3 or 4 spells, this is no longer actually a fair comparison, and this is actually a nerf to the champion overall. My assumption here, though, is that because Comet and Dark Harvest and Leandries and all these other things are more consistent, that was also carrying some amount of extra power budget. That was carrying some amount of extra damage. And so I thought that, technically over-nerfing in air quotes the spell was actually correct because of the other systemic impact the champion has, that it should probably be reasonable. Of course, if I am wrong, then that is my bad. This is an over nerf, and we will probably, look to buff him back up in 0.3. But that's the kind of logic behind this one. And then again, I figured that my assumption was this change was not inherently incredibly jungle skewed, like not massively so, though I think it was probably some level of jungle skewed. Walked back about 1% win rate of jungle mod. We never used this lever by itself when Brand got buffed in 0.20, I think, and then in 0.21 we did a quick a small tweak to his E and the passive. The E I thought would be relatively power neutral, and he gained about 1% win rate in jungle, and so I assumed that a 10% damage mod is going to be about 1% win rate in the jungle. So the goal is to put Brand jungle at about 50% win rate. Brand mid should be around 52, and Brand support around 50 would be the ideal case. I'm not saying we're going to get there, but I might talk later on in this video about like targeted resting win rates, but roughly around there should be reasonable for the champion, and so that's kind of the goal with that change. Next one is Rumble. Rumble is simply a case of he got statistically over-nerfed. We were targeting about 1-ish% win rate off the champion. We know one of the complaints about Rumble is how high the E shred can get. My belief is that we could make the E not stack, make the number actually higher, and players will think he's weaker despite being a stronger champion. Willing to track that down at some point when I'm not busy with other stuff, but I think it would be reasonable. Either way, though, Rumble was statistically over-nerfed in this patch, and so basically it's saying that, look, arguably his highest gameplay spell in terms of dodgeability and push and pull is the E, and so hey, if we took too much damage off this champion, then we'll give it back onto the E, right? We didn't nerf his durability. I think Rumble's durability is relatively appropriate. He should be fairly burstable. He has his W. I don't think Rumble should be more durable. I think Rumble should be balanced around how much durability he currently has. That is a lens that I take when doing live balance changes is, hey, can the champion be more or less durable based on what class they are, what their tools are, and whatnot? This is not just base stats, but also inherent spells like Silas W and Rumble W are obviously like tank outputs or durability outputs, right? And so I do sort of the mental math, the mental model of like, is this roughly the amount of durability based on their mobility, based on their range, based on what the counterplay looks like? Okay, yes, no. And then I figured that, yeah, Rumble should not be more durable. He, I think, is appropriately durable for his role in the game. Like, he shouldn't go further up towards Juggernaut, and he shouldn't go further down towards Skirmisher. He doesn't have the tools for a Skirmisher, nor does he have the tools or, details for a Juggernaut. So this is fine. Anyway, all this to say, this means we're roughing his damage back, right? The balance lever, as far as I'm concerned, for Rumble is his damage, and if we want to systemically lower all damage in League of Legends, that's fine if Rumble is part of that, but as a champion, I think his durability is pegged in about the right spot relative to other champions in League of Legends, and so if we want to lower damage in the game, we can, again, lower the entire damage in the game. I'm not going to go incrementally one by one towards Rumble, because I don't think that's the case here. Okay, to move forward, this is to say that I chose, again, probably his most gameplay skill, could have gone for his passive instead. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I think E, again, is a pretty reasonable spell. You can dodge behind minions, you can dodge a skill shot, you can spell shield, whatever. So here's a tool that is a fair place to give damage. I'm always a fan of giving Rumble good gold scaling. This means that playing Tord in a highly coordinated environment, playing Tord not bot lane is better, right? I mean, I remember watching back World Finals and pretty much every game was top diff from what I recall in mid diff. Not that Gumi's not cracked, but certainly I'm seeing a lot of complaints from AD carries that they're feeling they're getting one shot. I am happy to address this once we get burst under control. I think we're going to be there pretty close by 0.3, but obviously we know there's some AD carry satisfaction issues. That'll be something we probably tackle at some point, but this is not number one thing going on right now. Regardless, again, E is the gameplay button, or at least one of his best gameplay buttons, so okay, great, that goes there. The 3 base AD is simply saying that, hey, this is a pretty inoffensive way to give Rumble some feels. Q is not perfect at last hitting. There is some scripting around the Q to try to keep the minions from killing the minions from you when they're on fire. I'm not sure if it just doesn't work correctly, if it's not hooked up right, but under the hood, there's a bunch of logic there that at surface value seems like it should fire. You could still lose minions while they're under the effect of your Q, even though you're still doing damage to them, so something's going on weird there. Regardless, this is saying, hey, we did nerf the Q damage. It's a little bit harder for you to last hit. This is a last hit assistance for Rumble. He doesn't, of course, build any bonus AD. He has decent AD growth overall. He has okay-ish attack speed. He has a slightly okay attack animation. But hey, give him the base AD to make it a little bit easier to last hit, because it's just an easy way to say, yeah, let's just not make the champion punishing. He gets a bunch of attack speed from his passive, whatnot. Yeah, it's going to make his passive all in slightly better. Cool, that also has some gameplay around it, right? That's telegraph, that makes him stay in melee range. Like, that's also a fine place to have PvP power. Overall, Rumble just does, like, he does like 1,000 physical damage per game to champions. This is like, I don't know what, 50 total auto attacks before armor, so 100 total auto attacks by the end of the game. All right, cool. He's going to do 300 more damage. Like, that's not, that's not a lot of win rate, right? So it's meant to be kind of feels, but again, it's just meant to walk back Rumble to ensure that he has a relatively okay level of power. We know that Rumble is early game skewed. We know that Rumble is actually a fairly high mastery champion because skills you learn other champions do not apply to Rumble. He has a fully unique spell paradigm via his resources. And he has an almost entirely unique ultimate targeting paradigm. And so you have two different entirely unique outputs, or sorry, required inputs into Rumble. And yeah, guess what? He becomes hard to play. And so this will be a champion who's always like kind of bad in low elo, because on average low elo players don't have mastery on their champions. It just kind of tends to be true. Whatever. Anyway, next thing up is Teemo. There was a typo here. The AP ratio going up from 0.25 to 0.30. So this is a 0 to 8 damage increase on hit on the E, as well as a 5% AP ratio increase on the E. Now, of course, the nerf in 0.2 was a 5 AP ratio decrease. My instinct here is that the ult cooldown change was the heavy lifting nerf here. I don't believe that 5% AP ratio on hit for a champion that has 500 attack range is going to carry all of a like 3% or something win rate delta here. One thing worth noting is Teemo support is still around a 50% win rate champion. Teemo top and Teemo jungle really kind of suck right now. I think they're around like 47 or something. I forget exactly. And so I looked at Teemo's usage data, and Teemo support maxes Q first, and of course supports don't get a whole lot of levels, so it's a while till you get level 8 for rank 2E, and also doesn't get a ton of ability power because his baseline item gives no AP, and when you get Zaza, there's no AP on that one as well. But of course, when you finally get Malignance, around the time everyone else gets Malignance, then you finally get ability power. But like, a top laner is going to have a Doran's Ring and whatnot, and so it's just going to be different, right? And it's the fact that, again, I explicitly went for the rank up on E because, again, you actually max E first in the jungle and a top lane, so it's a buff that top and jungle will actually feel very aggressively, and it's going to be a meaningful part of the power budget. In addition to the fact that not only do they max the ability, they're using the ability much more often, right? Teemo jungle is literally auto-attacking in order to clear the jungle faster. Top lane Teemo is fighting melee champions and thus auto-attacking them fairly often. It's a little bit harder for support Teemo to auto-attack when like this risks Leona coming in and killing him, right? And Samir or whatever following up. Not that he can't be very good in these situations, but in general, right, I expect support Teemo will still max Q, and that'll be correct because of course blinding AD carry every 3 seconds is very, very powerful, no duh. And it's meant to be a top and jungle skewed buff here. Not much else to say. Let's talk about the bug fixes real quick. So there was a bug where Graves W would have strange interactions. I believe, so my understanding of this, I didn't QA it, but this is what I came across to me, was Graves W combined with Unflinching, combined with any champion who has consistent stat updates. So this is like Ornn passive and Rammus W, would get into really, really weird states where it would consistently force the stat update and would then just do that update like 100 times, and your bonus armor or bonus health or whatever would go to infinity very, very quickly. I functionally caused this because I shipped the new Unflinching rune. I was unaware of odd ways these things could interact. For whatever reason, this seems to be exclusive to Graves' Smokescreen, and specifically something like Unflinching. Ultimately, I don't want to call it spaghetti code. I also don't want to like dive into all the specifics, but essentially this is a one-line change, and this will make it so that Graves W and Unflinching and your champion having weird stat like multipliers in their base kit shouldn't make numbers go to infinity anymore. Okay, great. Karthus W, granting people MR. I don't know the full story behind here, but I know what the script change was. Karthus W, by the way, is an incredibly old spell. I might have talked a couple of times about rescripting abilities and how I've moved them to like the newer format where I can like call something MR shred and then, just like it's 0.25 or it's, 0.15 plus 0.05 per champion level, or plus 0.05 per skill rank or whatever. And then when the ability does something, it like looks up that data value and then it does whatever. The older version of that were called effect amounts. It's like effect amount 1, and you comment it and you say, hey, I'm commenting this to say that effect amount 1 is the MR shred value, and it's just like 0.25, 0.3, whatever, and you put it in. Karthus W is even older than that. Karthus W in the script for Wall of Pain says, when I cast this spell, I want you to create a table, and here's like, in this table, I want you to have a cell that says 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, and 0.25. I want you to index it against the skill rank and then apply that MR shred. Very old spell. That is not the current way to do anything, basically at all, but very old spell. Anyway, it seems to be that there was some kind of weird interaction where it was both creating that table as well as looking up an effect amount, and that was clearly doing some very wrong things, and that caused Karthus W to randomly give a very strange amount of MR and possibly send people on the pause or something. I'm not sure exactly. Again, I haven't dug into the entire script, but I saw what the change was, and the change was like, okay, let's, it was basically putting a bunch of stuff out and being like, no, let's just make sure we're only referencing the 0.25, then we're going to be good. So that looked fine to me, and so that one went in. And the Twist of Fate's red card was just a simple sort of human error thing where the logic of apply the slow to everyone was in the AoE damage portion where you're applying damage to the primary target from everyone else, and so the slow was put into the everyone else section, not in the right before we break out between me and everyone else section. So I mean, very minor thing there, but anyway, yeah, very easy to see where the script change was, and those are those big fixes. Okay, great. So that's what's in the patch. I like telling stories about bugs. I find them interesting. Anyway, I want to talk about how some of the projects that were already in flight that are in this patch now have landed, because we only have 1 day of data. A lot will change over time as players play more games, as players adapt to what the game state is overall. But I wanted to bring up a couple of things, which is how Karma's doing, how Jax is doing, and how stat shards are faring so far. Some interesting things here. Some of them are going to be interpreted, some of them are going to be usable at face value. Let's talk about it. So up first is Karma. So Karma support suddenly has double the pick rate of what she used to. She went from about a 4% pick rate support to about an 8% pick rate support. She seems to be decent. Malignance is still probably one of her best items, even in support, because, hey, it's possible to play a Quasi-Mage and it's reasonable. Her win rate is much closer. Actually, I might have the tab still open. I'm using public data here because I don't want to VPN in. Yeah, so she's like a 49% win rate support on average builds, but if you're smart enough to go Malignance, now, again, anytime where you're not playing the common build, this is someone who is opting in, that usually skews higher mastery. Malignance first item, Karma, is 51. That is fake data. That's not really a real win rate. That's probably still 50% win rate champion, but hey, Karma seems to have a pretty good number of opening options. Malignance, Shurelia's, Imperial Mandate is all seem pretty reasonable on her. Cooldown boots or Sork shoes seem fairly reasonable. Cool, 49% win rate Karma is not bad. That seems pretty reasonable. Karma mid is around 50% win rate. Now, the adoption rate of Malignance on her has shot up very heavily. I think it's around 2/3 of Karma players now are going Malignance first item. Before, it was under a half. Of course, mid Karma didn't really have a play rate before. Mid Karma's play rate, I think, 8x'd. It went from a 0.2% pick rate to a 1.5% pick rate, which is still not really, really high. I don't think a lot of mid laners want to play quasi-enchanters, but that's a respectable pick rate. And again, at 8x, so 10,000 people have played Karma in the last 24 hours, and that's really great. Or whatever the numbers actually are, right? But it's now enough data where it's okay, this is enough where I'm I have a pretty good indication of the win rate here in this champion. And it's cool, she's pretty reasonable. She's probably 50 and change. She's probably a 51 mid laner. I think that is very reasonable to have a supportive type champion perform very, very well in mid. I might talk about targeted observed win rates later in this video. I might not. There is a reason why. I will talk about intended observed win rates, but for now, whatever, it's fine. So Karma seems to be pretty reasonable. And there doesn't seem to be a role where she's clearly broken. She's a good mid laner. She's an okay support. I think she's a decent top laner, but seems to be reasonable. Seems to be building AP, which is kind of what we want. And okay, great. So far, so good. One thing worth noting is Karma mid players have identified that Cosmic Drive is very good. Cosmic Drive, I want to say, is probably this has been true for a long time, unfortunately. Cosmic Drive is a cursed item. Cosmic Drive has consistently been the most underbuilt item in League of Legends. This item is currently very, very, very good, and if players built it more, it would solve a lot of our burst damage problems because it's durability and haste, and so for any Rise, Ahri, Karma, etc. style champion where you're not a full assassin, and you're not you're not a full assassin. You're obviously not a juggernaut though. But like you want generically like a damage ability, a damage item with like a mix of repeatability and mix of durability. Cosmic Drive is like the perfect item for that. It gives you movement speed as well, which is like great for all these champions also. This item is incredibly underpurchased. I don't know how to make people buy it more, but this item was already good. Either way, mid Karma, Malignant's Cosmic Drive looks pretty good overall. Anytime where you're cherry picking build data, you're inflating win rates really heavily. So, she's probably not actually like a 52% champion with that build, but that is a very good build. I urge you to try it if you want to play a new mid laner who's quite good. Anyway, so Karma looks to be in a pretty good spot. That's awesome. Obviously, we have some over nerfs and over buffs that we talked about earlier right here in this section of the patch. Next thing I want to bring up is Jax. So Jax, I love me some toxic Reddit comments, but Jax lost like 2% win rate last patch, or this patch, I should say, where, it's, I don't want to paraphrase and strawman the vitriol, but like there's a lot of vitriol about like how dare we buff Jax, and it's like, turns out he's fine. Yeah, the math on his W and R affecting turrets is like, he does something like 20% more damage to turrets, which is like something, but also losing a bunch of E damage is more meaningful. The other thing I want to bring up actually is segueing now into stat shards, which is the magic resist stat shard is actually, or was I should say, stronger than the armor stat shard. And I'll give you two reasons why. Number one, in any like mature games, like level 5+ basically, and in some champions actually at level 1, but let's just say, first recall, so like level 4 onwards, virtually every champion has more armor than magic resist. And so if you're taking equal amounts of damage coming in, you would rather have MR than armor per point. But not only that, it gave you 8 MR instead of 6 armor. On top of that, the vast majority of magic damage, I shouldn't say vast majority, a large portion of magic damage coming in is from champions using flat pen, right? Sork Shoes is the most common mage boots by far, and Storm Surge was the most built AP item in the game by far. I was going to say Shirelius, no. Shadow Flame is not far behind it, as like I think it's top 5. And so lo and behold, there is a lot of flat magic pen, which actually further increases the value of 8 MR. So that shard has been good, and was good for all of 0.1. Of course, now it's gone. Relative to armor, where obviously there are lethality assassins out there, of course. Plenty of bot laners doing that, plenty of mid laners are doing that, some junglers are doing that. But also, there's plenty of physical damage dealers who aren't doing that, right? I would say most physical damage dealers are not buying lethality, which means that 6 armor is getting, I don't want to say it's diminishing returns, but it's getting that same like linear scaling you're getting from stat growth. And so the actual heavy lifting of that armor shard is not very high. Next thing I want to bring up is Jax is not a pure physical damage champion. Now, certainly by the end of the game, Jax's like total throughput in the end of a full game of League of Legends is about 60% physical and about 40% magic damage. But the asterisk there is he's buying Sundered Sky or Trinity Force or Titanic Hydra or not Jackshow, Spear of Shojin. He's building a lot of physical damage items, right? Certainly, yes, the R is going to scale with level, W is going to scale with rank, whatever E is going to scale with enemy champion health, but at the end of the day, Jax's physical damage actually scales very aggressively with game time and gold. His magic damage only really scales with ability ranks on like 2 abilities. So what that means is Jax's early damage is actually very magic damage heavy. Very magic damage heavy. And by the end of the game, Jax is doing 60% physical and like 38% magic, some true, of course. Red buff and ignite if he runs it, once in a while. So what that means is when we moved from stat shards that gave a little bit of armor, because every top laner is going to run armor against Jax, even though he's not that physical heavy. What that means is when the stat shards moved away from armor MR into health, now your stat shards are full power against Jax when they weren't before. So much like a bunch of bot lane mages lost win at this patch because they're no longer running against armor seals or armor stat shards, Jax is also no longer running against armor shards and meaningfully gets weaker. Now, I can't tell you what the exact impact is. Some of that is stat shard, some of that is the E nerf, and then some of that is his power gets clawed back from the turret damage buff, which again, very negligible. So through some mix of two things, Jax lost like 2% win rate. I don't want to say I fully saw it coming because I didn't expect Jax to lose 2% win rate off of the combination of those factors, but like, Jax isn't OP anymore, folks. I'm very curious how long it's going to take people to realize this. Because, yeah, suddenly half his kit isn't ignoring your stat shard anymore. Okay, sure, the E is doing percent max health damage, but like, whatever. Okay, let's talk about stat shards so far. And the interesting learning I have here, and actually, I remember I worked with very briefly. They reached out and we coordinated the team that handles the recommended rune pages that you see in Champ Select. Because the way it works is like partway through the patch, they have to build the table, right? Because what happened basically is those recommended pages are like those are a file in League of Legends functionally, and those get built by a robot every patch. And obviously, like this has to get built before the patch goes live, right? So this means that it has to get built before you're done playing on 14.1, but probably gets built after you're playing a little bit of 14.1 would be my guess. I don't know the exact situation here. Maybe it actually is based off 0.24. I don't know all the details here. Clearly, Malignance is getting recommended, so it's doing something, right? Either way, data-driven item recommendations are actually literally they're files. Like I can edit them by hand if I want to change the data-driven recommendations to Jinx for some reason and overwrite them manually. Outside of like making an actual manual override, which is its own thing, which would live over the top regardless. I don't want to get into rec edits too much though. Anyway, they were informed that we were changing stat shards in 0.2. And so they're like, oh, can you merge this down to release in time so that we can go and write a script that changes every recommended armor and MR shard into the scaling health one that's going to be in row 2 and row 3. So sure, of course, it's totally fine, whatever. Which means, by the way, that like none of your pages are broken if you like didn't touch your new rune pages. Your default recommended Jax page, your default recommended Samira page, or whatever, it's just going to like, oh yeah, you normally run armor. Well, now you're running scaling health. So because of that, what I found very interesting was we get a very, very brief glimpse into the floor of how many players look at the rune pages. So this is the floor, right? So what I'm saying here, I'm going to give you the data. I'm going to get you my interpretation of it, okay? Roughly 65 to 70% of all players are running the scaling health stat shard in row 3. What that means, and then of course 30% of players, roughly, are running flat health or tenacity slow resist in row 3. So what this means is at least 30% of players, when they played a ranked game of League of Legends on this patch, like notice the patch notes or notice there was something different or whatever it was, and I shouldn't even say of players, 30% of games played exhibited this behavior. Take that as you will. Trying to interpret the stats like in the most correct way possible. But at least 30% of games played exhibit this behavior where the row 3 stat shard was moved because there was no carryover otherwise. Okay, that's fine. And I should asterisk that if you made your own manual page, they would throw up an error and be like, hey, by the way, this rune page is invalid. You don't have a rune selected here in like row 2 or row 3. Depending on what you were running, right? I think if you're order running scaling health, it would keep that because that's the same rune ID. Whatever. There's biases here, right? Don't get me wrong. Okay. Of course, there's some players who looked at it and said, actually, I'm looking at these options and I would still rather run scaling health. So that's like some other percentage of players, above 30%, that are also doing that. So that's what I found kind of interesting, right? Was at least 30% of players, 30% of games manually switched off from their scaling health shard to the new tenacity or flat health one. And then some other percentage of players knew that they could have done that, but they chose to stay with scaling health. And then some other percentage of players just never looked at the rune page. Something around there, right? But it's cool that like we have a kind of floor at 30% of players like made a manual change. Again, either because they looked or because their rune page literally errored out and said, hey, by the way, you don't have a rune here. And there's like literally an exclamation point. It's like, hey, by the way, warning, your rune page is weird. Okay, fine. Let's now talk about the results so far from stat shards. I spot checked a few champions. Again, this is like under 24 hours of data, so this is like far from conclusive. It seems like there are some champions where move speed is their best stat, and there are some champions where tenacity is their best stat, and a lot of champions where it's not. Great. So far, the tuning seems to be relatively appropriate. I think Singe likes the move speed. I think I forget who else, but like whatever. I spot checked a couple champions, seems to be pretty okay. So far, tuning seems reasonable on stat shards, but I'm not sure. Other thing I want to bring up is for almost everyone that I've spot checked, the flat health rune is outperforming the scaling health rune. Now, this again has the same bias as we have with recommended items, where if you're opting into modifying your rune pages, you're probably a better player and you're probably going to win like the average game you're playing. Just on average, it just tends to be true. So, hey, asterisk there, right? Or like your champion enough to actually look at the rune page, and there's enough there where you can kind of surmise that would happen to some degree. Regardless, exists to some amount that on average the flat health rune is winning more games than scaling health rune. Whatever. Okay. Let's move forward to the next topic, which is part of the reason I drove this in the first place was I wanted to make changes to free up some room to balance mages that are ceilinged by bot lane. So we have data for Swain, Seraphine, and Ziggs in bot lane, comparing 14.1 to 14.2. Now, the asterisk here is that we're comparing all of 14.1 to 14.2. So if a core item they liked got nerfed, they're going to lose win rate. If other things change, that will also impact the win rate. So don't take this as pure gospel. But Swain as a bot laner lost about 0.5% win rate. Asterisk though, or but, here's the interesting thing. Swain as a support gained about 0.5% win rate. So we closed the gap between Swain bot and Swain support by about 1% win rate. Seraphine bot lost about 1.7% win rate, and Seraphine support gained, again, 0.5% win rate. So we closed that gap by 2%, from around a 6% win rate gap to around a 4% win rate gap. That is awesome. That gives a lot more room to maybe make changes to Seraphine. That's a really, really good thing. Now, it means that StatShard can't explain away everything, but wow, that is a really, really big change. I would assume that Seraphine is a champion that players were even less likely to realize they wanted to run armor or MR against, because Seraphine is so often a support in many other roles. But also this could be, hey, limited data. Like, there could be a lot of reasons why, right? I'm not saying this is exclusively the only reason, but like, this has been a pretty consistent thing. Ziggs as a bot laner went from 49.3 to about 48.6. So we lost, again, about 0.5, 0.8-ish% win rate in bot lane. And then, of course, Ziggs is not a real support. So I just pick another random mage that is a common support, which was Xerath. Xerath got no direct changes this patch from my recollection, and it went from 50.95 to 50.90. So it seems that this overall StatShard package change did not move supports in a negative way at all. Instead, it seems to have moved mage supports up a little bit. And every mage bot lane that I've actually measured, all the relatively common ones, have gone down, in some cases 0.5%, in some cases 1.5% win rate, giving us some more room to balance. I've seen someone bring up that Ziggs is kind of bad right now. I agree. We can totally buff Ziggs. That is totally fine. But the nice thing is this change has seemed to have an impact of raising up several champions in roles where they were weak on and bringing them down to roles they were overpowered on. Karthus is another, of course, common mage bot laner, but he got direct buffs last patch, so it's not relevant to measure him in any way. There's nothing to do there that would be useful. So really glad to see that happening. It seems like the overall tuning on Shards has been pretty good, and in terms of actual like measurable impact, averages out to about a 1% win rate drop in mage bot laners and about a 0.5% win rate increase in mage supports, which is good. Again, closing that gap, generally pretty useful. I have not looked at their mid lane performances or whatnot. Can at some point, of course, but overall seems like the things that we're measuring in 14.2 have been good. Again, some bug fixes, some balance changes up here. I somehow made a 30-minute video out of 5 lines, but again, I was talking about other stuff here as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.